We are delighted to have Caroline McMillen here, the Chief Scientist of South Australia, and Caroline's going to spend a bit of time talking to us today. So Caroline commenced her role as Chief Scientist of South Australia in October 2018, having served as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle for 7 years from 2011. Caroline is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, a Fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales, and a Bragg Member of the Royal Institution in Australia. She holds a Bachelor of Arts, Honours and a Doctor of Philosophy from University of Oxford, and completed medical training from the University of Cambridge. She's served in academic leadership positions at Monash, at the University of Adelaide and at the University of South Australia, where she held the role of Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research and Innovation prior to moving to Newcastle. So Caroline's been a member of numerous boards and bodies, research policy and assessment panels, industry groups, etc., etc. Too many for me to list here, but I guess in summary, throughout her career, she's been committed to building collaborations between universities, government, industry and community that drive innovation and have a positive impact on the economic, social and cultural health of Australia. And more than that, she's a really active champion for science education, and for the next generation of scientists, and a really strong advocate for increased participation of women in science. We're really proud to have you here, Caroline. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks very much indeed, Karen, for that generous introduction. And I'm delighted to be here, in part to provide a backdrop in terms of global and national trends in STEM education, research and innovation, particularly as it pertains to the next phase for the strategic plan for science, to ensure that on all of our number plates, we can proudly call South Australian the state of science. So, let me just set a bit of a context within which this plan is developed. Oh, thank you. Sorry about my croaky throat. Against which this plan is being developed. It's no surprise to all of you in the room that across the globe in the last 2 decades, jurisdictions have gone through a number of economic transitions, particularly in a phase in the US and Europe when manufacturing moved offshore towards Asia, which competed heavily on price. That caused a number of ripple effects in particular cities and regions, which had to reconstitute their economy following a period of quite sudden, in some instances, economic decline, where the economies were exposed to one or at the most 2 major industry sectors. So traditional manufacturing, and to some extent in mining and resources, there have been a number of transitions. Now, that economic transition is variously characterized as transition to a knowledge-based economy, an advanced economy, a smart economy, or an innovation-based economy, but essentially represented a shift into a more digital transformation and harnessing technologies as they came through to compete not on price but really on the quality of the product for consumer and export markets. Now, in Australia, we were buffered in large part over a fair amount of the time from those shifts globally, because we had strong terms of trade, strong commodities prices. And that, in a sense, allowed us to continue throughout that period without much of that shift until relatively recently, when it's become quite clear in the last 5 years in particular that we're now run out of that buffer zone, and that for productivity and the economy and our lifestyle, our environment, our health to continue at the important level of economic and social benefit that we have enjoyed, we have to now make some of those transitions ourselves. And perhaps the canary in the mine, or in the mines, have really been those regional cities which were particularly exposed and in which those changes happened first. think Geelong with the automotive manufacturing collapse impacted as it did in Adelaide. Think Wollongong and Newcastle where I was recently, where there were really significant impacts as particularly changes in the boom-bust cycle of mining and, of course, the indirect consequences on the economy. And so facing those challenges a little later than others, you have the benefit of learning from others, the to-dos and the not-to-dos. And one night I was in a car coming out of Callaghan campus, the Bushland campus, turned on Radio National. It had been not the best day, I would say. Sometimes, you know, you've had a bad day in the lab or you've had a bad day in the office and things have just gone bung. About 9 o'clock, I'm listening with half an ear to Radio National, an American talking about the story behind the transition from rust belts to brain belts in the US and Europe. And talking about case studies that he and his co-author had done. Came in the next morning, said to Chris, Chief of Staff, Chris, man on the radio, American, I think, Tony, Anthony, something like that, written a book, Rust Belts, Brain Belts. We should bring him to Newcastle. And Chris, who was very polite and British, said, Caroline, have we anything else to go on? I went, no, I think, oh gosh, is at the time, headed off. Chris located Antoine Van Atmel, who'd been on Radio National, Fred Barker, who was his co-author. Antoine is an investment banker, Yale President's Advisory Board and Brookings Institution. Fred had been the editor of the Financial Times of Holland. And I cold called through Skype, an arranged Skype call. Antoine and Fred generously agreed to come to Australia, to come along the New South Wales coast and to talk with business leaders about their experience in those 37 case studies, where there was a profound economic decline and then a transition. Cities like Pittsburgh, like Eindhoven, Malmo, examples where they could draw from those case studies the roles of strong universities as anchors, which generally had research facilities with deep specialist knowledge. They may not be in the top 200 universities or 300, but they had research at depth and relevance. So University of Akron in Ohio, the big trucks that used to go through with the big rubber tyres. Akron had made the rubber and had a big industry. They were rerouted. That industry collapsed. In stepped the university with some remarkable polymer science that was, of course, relevant to their history in rubber making and now set up a next generation of polymer science-based industries. But you also needed visionary joined-up leadership. You needed governmental support for basic research or patient capital. You needed traditional manufacturing skills, people who did know how to make things from that traditional background of manufacturing, and you needed to be able to draw in the young wealth creators, 25 to 40-year-olds who came back to reinvigorate cities and regions, and also impatient capital, risk-based investment capital. So this is a really good backdrop because they went through with us, you know, the pluses and minuses of making transitions. The key, however, was take academic, industry, civic, state, federal government leadership and move as one. Do not go in the door and compete with your colleague who's coming out of the door of a minister's office. That provides the minister with a good excuse not to do anything at all. Very, very important key lessons learned that deployed in lobbying for Newcastle in particular and the Hunter, and demonstrably successful. This is a 10-year average expenditure in R&D as a percentage of gross domestic product in countries across the world against the multi-factor productivity, which is basically a good surrogate for economic growth. And it's not a bad relationship. Most of us in biology would accept that relationship. Others of us in engineering and nanoscience might have a few equivocations about the line of best fit. But for governments across the world, that's captured the eye. Australia, not far off the line. US, dynamic economy, well above that line. And when we look to Italy, down here, a bit below the line. They sort of truth-proof this graph for us, in a sense. Ireland, look at Ireland, remarkable. I don't know what the next 10 years brings for Ireland, but I'd keep that graph up in the office if I was them. So reasonably, what this allowed governments to do was to say that our future is embedded in research and development, and how can we begin to see the value chain, the research and innovation ecosystem, how can we characterise it, measure the inputs, outputs and outcomes in a more systematic way. The other backdrop to this phase has been an awareness of the changing roles of cities. Those travelling in the East see the imprint of the Silk Road on trade routes, on economies in history. In the West, we see the imprint of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the smokestacks and warehouse buildings and ports. But now we're moving into an era of cities built on being sticky for talent, attracting and retaining talent. And some of the work on cities, and this is a KPMG report of 160 cities, characterises these cities that have moved to be able to attract talent, to be able to reinvigorate their physical environment, the knowledge environment, the creative environment, have been characterised as magnet cities, where population growth and the equivalent of the gross domestic product for a city, the gross metro product, have both grown. And cities that went through a period of decline, and what KPMG have characterised as decline, then fight back, and then victory. So those three phases are captured in a fairly nice summary of those cities and some deep dives into 9 of them. One of them is Pittsburgh, and in my previous role, Newcastle had great synergy. Same DNA as a steel-making city where steel had left, rusting steel yards, and something had to be done. We brought the Vice-Chancellor, the President, out from Pittsburgh, and indeed the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, University of Newcastle, because of their work in maritime engineering along the Tyne. So how had these cities had the decline and the fight back? Great stories, business leaders listening astutely, understanding that this could be done. I must say, the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, University of Newcastle's Vice-Chancellor was introduced as the Vice-Chancellor of the other University of Newcastle. It was quite a surprise for him, actually, at the time. Anyway, so Pittsburgh here has moved to a tremendous history, traditional manufacturing skills, patient capital, incredible universities, Carnegie Mellon and Pitt, to name a couple, into robotics, automation, driverless cars, Google, Amazon, but maintained a focus on quality of lifestyle, maintained a focus on the DNA and values in the symbols of the products that people identify with the city, the press, and have maintained a very strong sense of identity. This came through strongly in that KPM report. University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, associated with about $1 billion worth of commercialization in pharma and bio and medtech. So a pretty profound fight back and victory. Their main issue now is workforce, being able to supply the skilled workforce that these industries now demand. But again, learning from all others. These are the key characteristics of magnet cities across the globe. Strong leadership. Young wealth creators, the measurement of number of patents per 10,000 in the population from this group absolutely directly co-travelled with the uplift in revenue. So really profoundly important to hold and attract creative industry, creative science, technology talent. They undergo renewal, they cultivate new ideas, have a definable identity and values base connected to other cities, and can raise funds through various sources to drive their agenda forward. Adelaide is absolutely quintessentially the magnet city in the making. When you compare living across in some of the megacities of the world, and Sydney and Melbourne come to mind, you really begin to understand, if you keep your identity, and Adelaide's strong identity in social justice in terms of renewable energy in the state. So the state and the city have a profound value proposition, and the key is, of course, to be the attraction for talent. And finally, there isn't anything about this you don't know. The Industry 4.0 agenda. Massification was initially the focus in manufacturing, powered by water, steam, electrification, joined up with IT for autonomous production, but now moved into a completely different zone where the technologies are interconnected. They emerge from different branches, whether it's in biological sciences, chemical sciences, engineering, IT transformation, and join up to create the production of intelligent, informed products. And reasonably, one of the biggest changes in the past decade has been how disruptive technologies have emerged from all branches of STEM, and how they have become almost platform technologies across most major industry sectors. So they've not been confined to their original disciplinary field nor original industry sectors. They've taken a life of their own. I show this because about 2013 it came out, and I show it because it's really boring now, really boring. Yeah, cloud technology, big data, renewable energies, Internet of Things, 3D printing, peer-to-peer sourcing, robotics, autonomous transport, AI, machine learning, and advanced materials, biotech, and genomics. Now, the thing we forget, in 2013, we didn't think this was boring. We thought this was science fiction. We thought in the main, in the community, yeah, they're dreaming. And that's our natural response. Now, if you look at the artificial intelligence here, it's called pretty well, 2018 to 20. In the World Economic Forum, there's a deal of work to pick the technologies that are going to impact on markets in 3 to 5 years from their publication. And so this really shows the prescience, and there's a deal of data and know-how go into that analysis. What I quite think is really important, because by the time industry colleagues and SMEs get to work with something as difficult to conceive of what artificial intelligence is, it's being seen as a technology driver. It's often good to track the origins of these technologies when governments are thinking about where they may invest in terms of the next wave of technologies that are going to come through and provide a benefit to industry sectors to get to a global export market. This is a complicated graph. It's from a Savia report. I commend it to you if you're interested in this. This is every known research output. It's web scraping, and it's using machine learning to understand machine learning. So what they've done is they haven't put in keywords. They've allowed the keywords to come up from the literature. They've then segmented those fields which made up the broad annual output of what could be related to artificial intelligence research. So what you can see here, 1998, it was mainly made up of computational linguistics. Now, I don't know if any of you are computational linguistics people, but by and large, in 1998, if you'd met one, you would think it was really interesting and quite academic and never going to go anywhere. Pretty certain of that, because we always are certain that the future will be the same as the present. In fact, that dominance of the field occurred across most of this period of time, then uplifted the field actually of artificial intelligence that was beginning to be spoken and heard of in that domain. And what was interesting, in 1998, we started with that as the basis of the research field. And then in 2008, we had the smartphone. We did not know the relationship here. We thought this was great academic interest. 2008, the product of that emerged. Similarly, if you look at the field now and you see a couple of the areas, machine learning, obviously now becoming more codified as a term and defined, but also look at the purple space. Computer vision, not doing too much here, and then emerging as a very large segment. And facial recognition. All of us who've travelled across in Asia, we know when our bags go through, they know it's our bags because we are under security and there's good facial recognition against our passport. So these fields start in unlikely ways through highways and byways in communities of researchers, and then are translated, of course, into fields of profound importance. And oftentimes, we as scientists or chief scientists or government politicians say, what do you think is going to happen when you look at this? And it's always good to reflect that by the time we've got here, we're actually, the reason that list has been published is we're somewhere in this zone where it's okay to call that this is going to be a frontier technology that was initially disruptive and is now platform technology. Just how disruptive can it be? I like this because this is Mr. Jack Ma, who was a tremendous philanthropic benefactor of the University of Newcastle. These are our students, and we're in Hangzhou, where the Alibaba headquarters is. And for those of you who have visited, you will know this is our most remarkable site of innovation. You just cannot be blown away by how much is coming down the line. And this gives you an idea of the impact of it. Last year, one day, Alibaba Singles Day, the big day, particularly in China, but across the world, where there's an expectation of major sales. $30 billion in sales in 24 hours. The first billion was taken and transactions were complete in 85 seconds. The first order was delivered to Washington and a customer in Washington in 8 minutes. How's this achieved? Because the algorithms have allowed the company to understand where the customers are across the globe, what to put in the warehouses, where the robots will start working to pick those orders up as soon as the starter bell has gone. The next piece of disruption, however, if you're a mining company and you think you're a geosciences, earth sciences based company, that's fine. But Google are now working with Kazakhstan in the mining industry. Maybe the mining industry is a supply chain industry, and the most important thing is logistics and the artificial intelligence behind that and interoperability, and the other part about getting the minerals and resources out of the earth is a small part, flipping an industry on its head because of the capability that AI can bring. And it's worth thinking through those consequences for industry partners. This is now 2018, and this is the most recent list. And there are some things we would expect: precision medicine, artificial intelligence-led molecular design. No longer need we pick up a pipette. That would be quite nice. As somebody who has spent more of her life pipetting than she need. Artificial intelligence that can argue and instruct. So your vacuum robot might explain to you the error of your ways because you haven't cleaned under your sofa in a month. Or your fridge might seal itself shut because you've asked it to, because you really don't want to eat whatever nice things are in the fridge. It wants you to eat the vegetables and fruit on your hob. So the whole point about making artificial intelligence more like human intelligence is so we won't know when we are arguing with the person who notionally is asking us to pay our electricity bill, when we understand we have paid it and we don't realise we're talking to a robot. So that's coming through, obviously. Lab-grown meat, huge market, huge market. Carpaccio, 1 stem cell thick, thank you. Gene drives, plasmonic materials as new energy, and here quantum coming in. Obviously, think of that AI graph, think of the work that's been done, and now think of the wave that's coming through in technologies and communications, materials and space. And finally, the piece that's really shifting us as universities is the challenge of moving out of disciplinary fields. I don't call them silos because I don't think in truth most scientists are siloed at all in their thinking. It's our buildings are often standalone because they're of another era, and there's no doubt we have very strong traditional methodologies and cultures within STEM-based fields. This report is worth reading, if any of you have missed it, from NIH event in MIT, which essentially said, how come these are the problems facing us in the US healthcare system, where our costs are going to rise to almost 20% of our GDP by 2024 for health, which is untenable, when we have some of the world's best health and medical research. These are the things we need, and the NIH brought a whole wonderful list of expertise to bear. earlier diagnostics, prevention, of course, novel, lower-cost diagnoses and treatment, get in soon, get in earlier, and get in with different technologies. And one of the key platform or base causes for this mismatch between capability and outcome for the healthcare sector, they put down to not harnessing the digital transformation, not harnessing new material science, not harnessing robotics and sensors, and not bringing that together. Now, here at Flinders, you obviously have the lead medical and health device sector, but this was a profound, necessary and required collision, in fact, convergence, not interdisciplinary, actually converging to form new disciplines. So we used to think of multidisciplinary as separate disciplinaries working together, then interdisciplinary, yes, so bringing physics, material sciences, biologists together for wearable materials, yes, bioengineering. But the next phase is where you actually create new disciplines from the convergence of the knowledge base from separate sectors to become a singular strand, a thread, rather like that segmented graph from the artificial intelligence as it emerged and machine learning emerged. And this is all about growing a new limb. For those of you who think that's science fiction, this is a program as summarised in the Convergence report going on at the Defence Advanced Research Programs Agency. And for those of you who know about DARPA, very well funded, billions. So this is not science fiction. So essentially, we've moved into a very challenging, in some ways, environment, both for the research and new knowledge creation and equally for its application. And industry trying to understand where it can get foresight from. Universities and research communities are where you seek foresight. Is this going to happen? If it does, will it matter to my business? If it does, what can I do about it to intervene? And that source of knowledge is really the value. So, South Australia, that backdrop is entirely and completely relevant to where we sit and anywhere in Australia sits in relation to thinking about how we address challenges within our state and beyond. And for South Australia, we have had a period of economic decline. We've had a period of jobs loss, our wages have been lower, and there has been that really shoulders down sense in the state for a little while. And that is, of course, a consequence of a decrease in advanced manufacturing and some of the mining sources and indeed some of the commodities that we've been used to underpinning our economy. And without an economy, we don't have the opportunity to have a great healthcare or terrific environment. We really have to, in a sense, wear through those tough years and get ourselves through in South Australia to the fight back and to the victory. And there's no reason why that can't happen as in other jurisdictions. The South Australian government has a very ambitious growth agenda, and these are the sectors, the industry sectors, that it's saying we have to grow our economy through industries that innovate and take new products, services and processes to a new global market. So export industry, our local customer base is not going to be sufficient, and even Australia in most instances. These are familiar industry sectors to you all, and they are the priority sectors. So within that, we want to see an increase in business expenditure and R&D. The Advanced Growth Manufacturing Centre's report on 3,000 manufacturing businesses showed, for instance, that those businesses which export to the world, have new to the world products through innovation, are those that are R&D intensive in expenditure, large patents portfolio, and a very skilled workforce. Increasing our competitiveness and growing export, generating that new IP and supporting startups, increasing the risk capital, the private, the inpatient capital investment and reinvestment from national, international companies, productivity, sustainable employment, and strengthening the regional economies across the state. So it's an equitable distribution of prosperity. So this is our challenge, and it's a challenge firmly with us. It's firmly with STEM. I put a double M. I hope Karen appreciates that. Science, technology, engineering, maths, and those med health, med tech, key pieces of healthcare, because in convergence of disciplines, we're now moving along to harness every part of that STEM value chain into healthcare, as we saw. So, challenge for a chief scientist, and people often say, "Oh, it's great, lovely title. What do you actually do?" Small question, polite, but nevertheless asked. And reasonably at this point, the role is, having taken stock of the state government's agenda, is to then ask how and in what way we can understand our current state of science, and in what way can we deploy against the background we've reflected on in technology and what we've learnt globally to really get to the future quicker through STEM research and innovation. Now, I talk about a value chain because I firmly believe there is a value chain. And in terms of supply chains, industry sectors understand you start somewhere and you end with a product and an outcome. It's not a bad metaphor, but of course, in knowledge creation and the relationship to knowledge transfer and then the application of knowledge to get the outputs and outcomes is not necessarily linear. It's complex, it varies between different fields in terms of the rate of creation and transfer and application. But what we do know something about, and we would agree, is some of the enablers. The enablers are pretty consistent for all STEM value chain. Might be differentially weighted in terms of the roles of enablers. So as a chief scientist, one of the issues is to think carefully through about those enablers and whether they're present at the level to which will ensure different industry sectors' strategic plans, different government strategic plans across agencies can thrive. Let's look a little bit about the current state, and now let's look at Australia at large, and this is Australia gross expenditure on R&D by sector. Now, for those of you for whom this is not necessarily familiar, this is calculated every year, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, business expenditure, that's everything the industry puts into R&D, whether it and that puts into R&D for its own purposes. This is government for its own purposes, higher education for its purpose, private non-profit. Basically, if you look here, we were going up in total gross expenditure, going up and now down. So this now means our proportion of our GDP that's R&D expenditure has gone down. And this looks like it's holding after the modelling. If you ask the question, why has it gone down? Most people would say, well, it's the government, isn't it? Government's not putting enough money in. Well, it may not in absolute terms, but it doesn't explain why it's gone down. Because if you look here, it's actually flatlining, but it certainly hasn't fallen. Higher education, this includes money the higher education sector puts into everything related to R&D, including salaries, including money it invests itself in research, and you can see it's going up as the demand-driven system, interestingly, has gone up, as buildings have gone up related to R&D. Now look at business. Business went up, it was strong, and it's gone down. And that is the most significant impact on that fall of our proportion of R&D as a proportion of GDP, is business expenditure and R&D, and it is in the state as well. Okay, hence the government focus on how can we bring business in to become more R&D intensive. Now, a chief scientist has an interesting ecosystem. There are government agencies, and if we think of these as being responsibilities in research for government agencies across government, productive land and sea, minerals and resources and mining, Department of Energy and Mining, or you could think of agriculture in this space and agribusiness and wine. You could think of the blue bioeconomy in terms of environment, water, low carbon, energy, renewables, from Earth to space, and then what happens if we translate the gains of that technology from space back to Earth. And so sovereignty and security and defence, health for health, and we can keep going. And so we already have good departments with good strategic plans at levels of maturity. Equally, we have these priority industry sectors, which themselves have strategic plans carved, shaped, formed. But from a perspective of the value chain, and these don't relate to these sectors, they're meant to go across all of the sectors, it's reasonably a question of thinking about the enablers of excellence. You can't take anything to the world unless the world values it as being of additional value than that which it already has. You absolutely need collaboration. You need across global, national collaboration between researchers. You also need collaboration between business and research, or research and industry, or SMEs. You need to pull out from knowledge transfer that occurs with collaboration, the innovation, and then translate it. And you absolutely need a future workforce, or else all of this will happen, and then we'll hit the reef of an unskilled, lower-powered workforce, unable to carry the agenda through. And it's in the what you can say is these enablers are essentially pretty similar across each of the areas of industry and each of the government agencies. They differ in the skill sets, they differ in the nature of the collaborations. But if there is a weak point in that value chain for any one industry, and it might be less collaboration in one, it might be no innovation and translation in another, that value chain will not work to support the state. So I'm just going to go a little bit through now the current state of science and a couple of things. Excellence, we would say, excellence needs funding and investment, we would say. Investment, and this is the higher education research data collection funding in each state as a proportion of the total funding. The national total of HERDC funding is $3.9 billion. That's a lot. That's a significant amount. Okay, so that's a good slab of funding. How did we do? Well, what we have here is the proportion of the share of funding every year between 2012 and 2017. We're always yellow, so here we are yellow. And that's our share, and on this scale, it looks as if us in Western Australia have just sort of got a gentle decline in our share of funding. You know, here we have New South Wales as reasonable, Victoria's grown, Queensland's come down more demonstrably. But when you look at this is South Australia's percent of the total funding available that universities earn. This is all earned by universities for research for any source. What you see is a quite different one when you put the scale from about 8.6% to about 7.4%. Now, that declining share means that as the total funding has increased across 2012 to 2017, we access less of that increase than our colleagues. And we have to pause and reflect about why that might be. And we'll come back to that in discussion, perhaps. However, the positive here is this is the quality of our science, the citation impact. Of course, normalised. This is all STEM publications, good, bad and the ugly, absolutely collected across the period 2009 now to 2017, a 10-year period, into one histogram, and any discipline that uses a scientific method in the mix. So we haven't selected anything out. And this is where you look at the citation impact, if it's above 1, above world quality. ACT, strong. ANU, strong, driving that. Victoria, pretty good. South Australia, number 3. And if you look at the yellow here, this is the actual time trend across the period. Look where we're going. We're about to overtake ACT. Yay! Go us. Send a note to Brian Smith. Perhaps not. Okay. So that's terrific. So we have quality. But we're not leveraging the quality. We're getting out of bed for $10,000 a day rather than, $2 million for the same idea that our Eastern State colleagues can sometimes do. Then what we look at across the board, we're pretty good across the board. This is South Australia across the different disciplines, and you can keep going. But physical and mathematical sciences, ICT, engineering, medical and health sciences. So we've got excellence to converge. We've got really good assets, but we're not harnessing them as fully as others. Now, what about collaboration? This is international co-authorship. This is the proportion of outputs with an international co-author. Again, ACT leading the pack, Western Australia up here, then New South Wales, then Queensland. I mean, Victoria's some way back, and so are we. And we started lower and we've risen in parallel, but we're not where we should be. And that's an issue for us. How can we help our industries get to the world if our address books are not as strong as our state counterparts? And here's a better one, perhaps. This is our industry shared outputs. Victoria now leads the way, New South Wales, Western Australia again. Here we are, fourth, so reasonable. Interesting ACT, really strong in quality, great global collaboration, but not a strong industry base to collaborate with in the ACT. So it's a very interesting picture in each state. But look at South Australia here, not bad in the 10-year window, but look where we're going. And this is in a state that has invested in innovation neighbourhoods. It's invested in Tonsley. It's invested in the West End. It's invested across the north of Adelaide. It's invested in industry partners and future industries institutes and all of the above. And yet it's not growing. So what to do? This is where you now get into that piece where you begin to suggest ways forward that, in a sense, have a relevance for each of our priority industry sector, but are enacted and enabled specifically for each industry sector as an enabler, sort of, as it were, customised to that sector. If we think of excellence, we need patient capital, government funding. We are not harnessing the big scalable funds, what I call scalable excellence, the Medical Research Future Fund. CRCs we've been quite strong in actually, but fallen away a little bit. Some of the big centre fundings. So scalable excellence, I would say, based on our great track record in outputs and quality. Our global standing, how can we build that particular piece more strongly and attract talent across the world? And above all, maintaining top flight, world-class infrastructure. So we can look at strategies associated with those. Collaboration, global innovators, leading researchers who walk out of the door, collaborate with industry, and are able to bring groups together from different campuses or different innovation neighbourhoods who are not confined by a definition of my university, my campus, my precinct, my neighbourhood, my field, my discipline. This is leadership, not my ship. And that's really important in the current environment. Industry doctoral training centres, which are in different forms, but now focused on the needs of the priority industries with industry supervisors, university supervisors, including SMEs, and curated well to drive industry outcomes as well as outputs. Frontier Technology Capability Centres. How, if you're an SME, will you understand quantum potential for your business? You're not going to fly across the world. You don't have the luxury of always being able to get across to Melbourne or Sydney. We need foresight and know-how in those disruptive technologies to translate. Some we do well, some we can enhance. In the UK, intermediaries like catapult centres form the basis then of knowledge transfer networks. We haven't in Australia curated systematically innovation and translation. We often have very good events, very good ways of bringing people together, but it's not necessarily enduring, systematic and invested in. We need the impatient capital that comes from those, and we need that co-working spaces so it's not haphazard in the way in which our environment operates to welcome, attract, support, engage with the full value chain with our business and SME partners. We do parts of it really well, but it's not necessarily consistently smart across the sectors that we're interested in working with. Enabling the future workforce, our skills, the demand-supply issue is going to be profound for us in South Australia, and diversity of STEM. If we throw away half of our workforce inadvertently by not taking notice of the fact of the low participation in STEM from a number of parts of our communities, including women, then we are going to pay a price in about 5 to 10 years. And that's a heavy price already paid, I might say, in the sector already. So how to implement some of that? Really, we've got the building blocks. The state has done a profound investment in knowledge and economic assets, in supporting institutions with knowledge creation, but in physical assets, in building those innovation translation neighbourhoods that populate the south, the north, the east, the west, across regions, taking now the focus on networking assets. This is the piece of curation we haven't quite got at full pelt in South Australia. And so we reflect on the remarkable work the co-investment, the state, the university, research, industry have put into Tonsley. $4 billion in this precinct here in capital investment from the state, universities, research and industry pieces. Remarkable. But we're at some distance. So if you're an ag tech, how do you get some of the fallout and spillover of what might be happening in the medical device partnering program? Has that got anything to do with ag tech? Well, it might, because some of the solutions are solutions that have the opportunity to spill over into phenomics of pattern displays of what happens as those plants grow in different environments, and some of the image visualization we can take into pathology, we can take into ag and plant phenomics. How about machine learning, our Futures Industry Institute? And I could go on. These are just ones picked out because of the platforms that they create in these emerging disruptive technologies, which are, in a sense, unknown category. But we don't play. When we look at machine learning, do we say we have the number 3 institute in the world? Does it have a presence in a frontier technology capability centre across our innovation neighbourhoods? No, it will be within one part of the ecosystem. And that has cost and consequence. Lot 14, looking pretty here, on its way through, and will be a bit of a game changer for some of the certainly for startups and entrepreneurship. So ultimately, if you take those enablers, you deploy specific strategies against them with specific action plans in industry sectors, what you're doing is thinking now of the Wait, Tonsley, Lot 14 Health, Technology Park, Mawson Lakes, Osborne, Edinburgh Defence, and Elizabeth North, and you're thinking carefully through how and in what way this is a knowledge transfer network. Do we, how and in what way do we bring the creation, transfer and application strategies and priorities to bear across and within this remarkable investment that's occurred, but is still not yet at full pelt to deliver metrics of full success. And finally, just very briefly, we are going to, as universities and as within TAFE sector, going to be challenged to think through flexible pathways. If in South Australia you don't have maths teachers in particular regions and remote and rural South Australia, then, you know, if talent is everywhere and opportunity is not, does that mean we don't recruit that talent into our workforce?